Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last day of Dreamforce. Great to see so many faces here bright and early on Friday. Hope you've all had a great week so far, getting to learn a lot about Salesforce and meet your peers, co-workers, other people in the industry as well. Just a quick show of hands. How many people are here at Dreamforce for their very first time? Oh, awesome. That's great. And just for a quick indication, how many of you are developers? Great. And how many admins do we have here? Awesome, awesome. So hopefully today's session will cover off things that will be relevant to all of you. Name credentials are a great feature of Salesforce that are great for both developers and admins alike to really simplify and secure your API callouts. My name's Pei Huang. I'm the CTO of Groundswell Cloud Solutions. We're a Salesforce consulting firm based in Vancouver, Canada, and we've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of clients doing complex integrations between Salesforce and their other systems, whether they be legacy, in the cloud, or elsewhere. Before I move any further, I want to show you this slide, which I'm sure you're all sick of already, but just again, to make sure I don't get in trouble with the lawyers, anything I say and do may include some forward-looking statements. Please make your purchasing decisions based on what is readily available in the product today. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the background of API callouts and where name credentials fits in. I'll cover a little bit about the common options we have today for storing credentials inside our Salesforce org, and go through some reasons as to why you want to use this feature within your API callouts, your Apex code, and any other integrations that you may have. I want to walk through some examples. I think examples are the best way to show just how simple and easy they are to use. Cover off some advanced use cases for those of you who may have used name credentials before or want to do some things with it that are a little bit more complicated than what's available just with the easy steps. And then finally, present a quick set of resources for those of you who want to go away and learn some more about name credentials and use them within your Salesforce projects. So a quick primer on HTTP callouts. So callouts are where you can use Apex code to call out to external APIs. These might be your legacy back office systems. It may be other software in the cloud, things like Stripe for online payment processing, things like Twilio for SMS and telephony. And some of you may have other systems that your IT departments look after that you need to connect with Salesforce. So in Apex, this may be familiar to some developers in the room here. You simply start off by initiating an HTTP request. You set the method for the HTTP request, whether it's a GET, POST, etc. Set the endpoint, in this case, going to my fancy API. And then you send the request, get the response, and you can process that how you will, whether it's successful or failing. But this example was a little bit too simple. In the real world, we need to secure our API callouts. Whether it's your financial system, whether it's a third-party address validation service, all of these systems need to have security in front of them to prevent unauthorized users from accessing them. Things that you might also have may be commercially sensitive, whether it's algorithms or things like that that add to your competitive advantage. The other thing you might have to deal with is the fact that you have different credentials for your different environments. You obviously have your production systems, but I'm sure many of you have multiple sandboxes for development, testing, training, UAT, and so on. And for these different environments, you want to make sure you have the same secure level of storage of all of your credentials that are there. In addition to that, there are all sorts of different mechanisms for storing for executing authentication. Everything from password-based through to OAuth, SSL certificates, and some APIs even use custom approaches for doing authentication. And finally, quite often you'll have a system account, it might be an integration user or something you use to integrate, but in other situations you actually need to do things on a per user basis, and depending on whether I'm logged in or Bob from accounting is logged in, our API calls might have different permissions. So I want to ask this question, why can't I just put my usernames and passwords in Apex code. And I see some people shaking their heads in the audience, right? Hard coding credentials, although it technically works, is a very, very bad idea. It's a maintenance nightmare because what if the password changes? What if it's expiring and you need to update it? What if it got compromised and you need to very quickly make a change in production without affecting your users? Having these credentials hard-coded mean you need to deploy the changes every single time, and whether that's through change sets or through other deployment mechanisms is not the greatest thing to have to do. It's also very difficult to maintain the changes between your different environments. If you have this in your Apex code, how do you have it differ when you're in dev versus test versus production? And yes, there are ways to do it, but it's not particularly elegant. And it's also not very secure. Remembering most people these days will have their source code inside a source control repository, or you may be creating sandboxes where production credentials then end up in Apex code accessed by developers or external third parties if you're using some outside people to help you with Salesforce. So then what if I keep my credentials inside a protected custom setting, or I use custom labels or custom metadata types? These are some of the approaches that people have used before. And the important thing I just want to sort of call out here is, yes, this is definitely a way you can do it. You can avoid having to hard code your credentials, but you still have to do a bunch of work to actually use those credentials within your Apex code. In addition, a lot of these things really weren't intended to store secrets. Your custom labels were built to do localization, and that's what they're really great for. Custom settings, you can store things in them, but you have to be aware of things like what users can actually access them, for instance, through data loader or other tools, even if they're not actually Salesforce admins. So I think a really succinct way of explaining name credentials is something I saw in Kevin Porman's blog, where he says, name credentials offload the storage of credentials and authentication to a declaratively controlled process. What that really means is that we have the ability to have a really, really simple way to declaratively manage our credentials, and then our developers can use them within their code and also save a lot of time as well. So let's walk through some examples. This first one is a very basic example of a password-based authentication. So I might create the request, I will set the endpoint to my fancy API again, I'll define my username and password. So here I've done something I said we shouldn't do, which is hard-code it, but you could be retrieving it from somewhere. We have to now encode our authentication string, set that on the header, and then make the call out. So that's a bit of code, right? It's not super complicated, but at the same time, I end up repeating this for every single one of my callouts. And if I do make changes to my passwords, I could have different places I have to change that. So if we look at the name credential example, this is a much simpler way to do it, where I go into setup and I go to the name credentials section. Here I can define the URL for my endpoint. I choose the identity type of name principal and the protocol of password authentication, and I enter my username and password here. Salesforce then stores this very, very securely in the system for me, and then it means my Apex can be simplified. So let's take a look at what the Apex becomes now instead of what I had before. I create the request, set the method, so in this case still a get. I set the endpoint, but notice how here I reference callout, and the name of my name credential. At the end of this, I can append the other sort of parts of the URL that I need, depending on what resources I'm accessing within my API. And you notice here, I'm not manually getting a username and password. I'm not manually creating any authorization strings or setting headers. And I can simply go ahead and send that out. That's it. So really simple and straightforward. I get much smaller number of lines of code, and it's much easier to maintain because all of those credentials are stored inside the setup in a secure declarative way. How many people here have used OAuth before? Great. How many people think they really, really understand OAuth? Right? It's a little complicated. It's a very, very secure industry standard. It's something that Salesforce uses, a lot of other companies use, and is great for really securely authenticating your callouts. But at the same time, there are a whole lot of things to think about. You have to deal with your keys and client IDs and client secrets, your callback URLs, your scopes. You have to get, refresh tokens if your access tokens expire. There's a lot of moving parts to go through. Dealing with some of these things just require extra steps. And it's not impossible to do, and it's not super, super difficult once you've sort of dug through the documentation, gone through the trailhead a few times. But at the same time, you want to try and avoid extra complication within your code where you can. So what I want to do is talk through the example of doing this with OAuth. I'm not even going to bother showing you what the Apex would look like if I did it manually, because there'd be so many steps involved to do the process, store the tokens, use them, refresh them, and so on. And I want to show you really just how simple it becomes with name credentials. So here I'm back in the setup screen. You'll notice what I'm doing here is creating what's called an auth provider. Here is where I will put in my URLs, and I'll enter in my customer or client ID or consumer key and the consumer secret that I've got off the API service. So in my example here, it's Google, and I've gone and created that and copy and pasted those things down. I've set the scopes that I need for authentication. So depending on the API you access, you'll need to refer to the documentation as to what you need. Once I've got that authentication provider created, I can come back to this familiar screen, the creating of a name credential. Here what I can do is I specify, instead of password authentication, OAuth 2.0. What I have here now is I can then choose from this selector here the auth provider I created in the previous step. And what that means is that I'm now using that for this name credential. But you'll notice that in this process, I still haven't fully authenticated because I haven't been prompted to give consent. I haven't logged into this other service. You'll notice there it says authentication status of pending. If I go ahead and tick the box, start authentication flow on save, and then I save it, what will happen is Salesforce will now go through the OAuth flow for the first time. In this case, it's prompting me to log into my Google account. Google will then ask me, do you give Salesforce permission to do X, Y, and Z? And I can say yes. And once that's all said and done, we're good to go. The name credential is now authenticated. So that was a pretty simple process to go through, right? What does our Apex look like? Well, let's start off with our HTTP request. Nothing different to before. There's my set endpoint referencing my Google test name credential. And I'm not doing anything else. I don't have to think about access tokens. I don't have to think about refresh tokens. I don't have to think about usernames and passwords. You can see just how simple this is now. And I just go ahead, send the request, get the response, process it, parse it, whatever I need to do from there. How does this sound? What do you guys think? Right? Really great. So just to sort of recap what OAuth is being, what parts of OAuth is being handled by name credentials. It's handling that web server flow that you'd normally have to do manually. It's all declarative. You can see just how easy it was for me to set that up without writing any code to handle those OAuth processes. It generates and appends that authorization header for me and puts that all in place. And then it does the refresh for me as well. So you'll probably know that quite often, the access tokens will have some lifetime, whether it's 30 minutes, 12 hours, whatever you've defined in your other system. Here, Salesforce will just handle that transparently for me. I don't have to write any code to even think about it. So I want to talk a little bit now about some more advanced ways of using name credentials. The simple scenarios where you have APIs that are modern and standards-based is really, really simple and really easy to use. But what if I have an old legacy system that has some really strange way of authenticating, and I still want to be able to use name credentials to store my username and password and API keys? Well, if you look at the options on the right-hand side of this screenshot, there are some different options here. The first one is a default one, which says it'll generate that authorization header for me. So whether that's the basic authentication or the OAuth bearer token authentication, that's what that does for me. But then I also have the option of saying to allow merge fields in either the HTTP header or the HTTP body. What this means is then I can actually reference through Salesforce style merge field syntax, the curly braces, exclamation marks, so on, the values that are actually in the name credential and use these in custom code. So some of this may include things like special HTTP headers you have to set. It might be SOAP APIs where you have to get special values into certain parts of the request. You can go ahead and do that this way. So I want to just highlight a few of the commonly useful merge fields. First one here is username and password. So you can get this and you merge this in. If it was something like that, I can set these special authorization headers and get those in place, and it just goes through. Or if I'm using the OAuth flow, I can actually get the access token out this way. And Salesforce still behind the scenes will handle all the refresh and everything for me as well. And there's a full list of those in the documentation I've referenced there. But you can think of some really creative ways of using this to authenticate with APIs in a slightly non-standard way, where maybe it's not actually truly a username and password, but here's a way you can store those credentials securely. I want to give one example, where we had to use this in real life. And this was where we're using the Salesforce metadata API to update some things inside metadata through Apex. And in this case, I'm leveraging the great Apex MD API library provided by the team at Financial Force. And here I can instantiate that. And what I did is I simply changed the endpoint here to reference my name credential. And once I've got that, then I can then set the session ID to this merge field that I referenced before. Now this OAuth token is being pushed into that part of the SOAP envelope that's going out, and I don't have to hard code anything. I don't have to do a manual login activity or anything like that to get this to work. One of the things you can use this for is, for instance, if you have a Salesforce org, you need to run some batch Apex that maybe has to run as a different user. It has to maybe access another org and do some updates to, pick list values or something like that. You're able to do that where, one, you don't have a first-class session ID, and two, you need to be able to wrap something like this in something that's simple for you to execute. So the other benefits I want to cover off quickly about name credential include the fact that you now don't have to add that endpoint to your remote site settings. You can skip that if you're using name credentials and have the URL set up there. You can reference that same name credential across all of your environments. I've created something before called Google Test. I've done that in my developer sandbox or my Scratch org. I could push that all the way through, and all the admin needs to do is just update the actual username and password through setup, through the declarative config in the relevant environments. As I said before, it's really easy for admins to maintain, and I know there are some organizations where they want to keep people at arm's length from credentials, particularly production credentials in certain sensitive industries. And this is a way you can do that with that division of responsibility where the developers are able to still be productive while somebody else is able to go in and update the credentials with something, maybe it's for a financial system or a credit card system right there in production. Finally, recapping again that this is a really secure way of storing the credentials in Salesforce. Salesforce has an amazing team of developers and security folk who have very carefully looked at how they store these things so that the trust is being honored there, and that you can be rest assured that what you have is going to be safe, and you don't have to reinvent that wheel by coming up with your own encryption or whatever it is to store your passwords in Salesforce. I want to quickly touch then on the fact that you can do per user credentials. So here, the identity type in all my examples before I had was named principal, which means like an integration user or a single user. Here I can say per user, which means as a Salesforce user, I can go into my personal information here and I can actually enter my credentials. And you can think the examples like a sales team where actual sales reps have different credentials to an external system. They can just come into their profile, update that, and all of your Apex code and everything works and runs as that user when they're using the system. So, in the last minute, just to quickly recap, name credentials are awesome. We use them a lot, I use them all the time, and really encourage you all to do so as well. Name credentials, as I've explained so far in this session, really solve that common problem that we all have of securely storing and using the credentials that we need for authentication. We get to streamline our code, and we get to avoid hard coding credentials in Apex. And please, if you're doing this today, take some time and see if there's any way you could use something like name credentials to make it more secure, more maintainable, and easier. And finally, to recap again as well, we support, Name Credentials supports a number of different authentication schemes, including some that I didn't actually fully cover today. So do dig into this a little bit more and see how you may be able to use it within your environment. Here are a whole lot of resources. Have a look at these modules on Trailhead. These are really well written, really great in terms of covering both how to do things and the why behind it. I'll make sure to have these slides shared out through the session chatter within the app so you can grab these links and go with them. And I'll be here for a few more minutes if you have any questions, want to chat with me afterwards. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day and safe travel back home if you're flying back somewhere else. Thanks, everyone.